Hi, everybody. Fantastic to be here for this Hacking Democracy COG Extra, put together by COGX, of course, but also in conjunction with Fabric.
So we're here to talk about
Go ahead. I'm the managing partner of Fabric Ventures and thrilled to be here. So it is impossible not to notice the swirling impact of the US election around us and this incredible sight of Twitter warnings as to the validity or the falsehood indeed, or likely falsehood of statements made by the current, at least, sitting president of the United States. And I think in that context, it couldn't be more timely, although it continues to be timely on an ongoing basis to think about the state of democracy and how vulnerable it is to assault. And whilst we might have thought about it being vulnerable to assault, perhaps by kind of adversaries or kind of foreign nation states or agents or actors, it seems like there's an equal amount of threat internally these days. I think maybe just stepping back a little bit to what Fabric is about, we have a thesis that revolves around the open economy, the rise of the open economy, and that's underpinned by actually the new ability with technology to take control, to take ownership of your individual identity, of your data, and indeed the networks within which we actually habitually sort of run our everyday lives. And if you think about it, it's actually the enforcement of this property that allows us, this personal property that allows us to build amazing new companies, perhaps to reestablish a model for dealing with digital columns, for example, perhaps the social graph that Facebook has built its business upon. And then also I think it is being able to prove that a citizen has earned their right to vote and to ensure that vote is counted, that element of kind of property rights that underpins sort of society itself and indeed democracy. And I think, it's important to think that, to reflect on the fact that democracy is not just a concept that is pure principle that is understood and extremely well established. It's relatively new and fragile, and in fact, it's possibly not even a concept or a principle at all. It's really a set of technologies itself. So it's not surprising that technology can both threaten it, but also be used perhaps to establish a greater level of resilience for it. And so I think those three questions that we have in our thesis are actually the kind of pretty closely allied to the current attack vectors on democracy. That is, who are the voters? Can we be sure of who is voting? Can we be sure that we've counted the votes? And perhaps something currently that's kind of wrapping all those together, can we be sure of what the truth is? And I think I'd like to add one more to that, which is, can we use technology to move us from a world of getting by in terms of social media, being vaguely literate, to being highly competent, because I think that's going to be important to be a citizen, an effective citizen moving forward. So you can discover more about Fabric on our website and follow us on Twitter and all of those kind of things. But to kick us off, I would like to introduce a panel that is going to look specifically at how the open web, the set of technologies that underpin this burgeoning open economy, or Web3 as it's sometimes called, can actually help democracy out. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stephen Seven Waterhouse. He's actually the founder of Awkward Protocol, one of our portfolio companies, and a long-term collaborator of mine, to moderate this session and to introduce the rest of the panel and dig in deeply to these topics. Seven, can I pass over to you, please?
So we're here to talk about kind of Web3, help democracy, which is very opportune given recent events. For those of you watching this in the future, it's middle November in 2020, just after the US election. I'm joined by an illustrious panel. Cory Doctorow, who is a well-known author, activist, and journalist. Harry Halpin, who's CEO and co-founder of NIM. This is kind of cool. I'll just hear as I see them. Aaron Smith, who is author of Identity Reboot. I'm Aaron. And Vinay Gupta, who's CEO of Mataran. And I am Stephen Waterhouse, CEO and co-founder of Orchid. All right. Hi, everybody. So it's been quite a year. And it's been quite a year for democracy. It's been a year for the collection of things we call Web3, the industry that we all, most of us work in. I wanted to just get a little sense from each of you about how your work has, the kind of work you are really focused on right now, and also how it's changed this year. We don't need to do a full COVID introduction like we do in most meetings. Just get a little sense of your belief around the collection of technologies or other things that we call Web3. I think of it as decentralized systems, and how it relates to democracy today and in the future. And we'll start from there. So maybe starting with you, Corey.
Yeah, I guess the big shift that I've experienced in the last year is the extent to which all of these issues have come into focus as being related to competition and monopoly, and how that seems to connect with a lot of other issues that are ongoing in our world, where the problems of right to repair and Medtronic ventilators seem hard to separate from the questions of technology companies being able to dominate the way that our kids are learning, or the way that our news is being handled, and so on. The fact that Twitter is putting misinformation notices next to the president's speech is significant. But what's even more significant is the fact that the president really has no choice but to remain on Twitter, endure the indignity, and simply complain about it, that we don't have a multiplicity of public squares where the president can go and engage in speech on rules that suit him. And, it's fine, he's the president. But there are lots of people who have a lot less social clout who struggle with this issue in a way that's a lot more salient.
Thanks, Barry. I see you touching on a number of points there, which I'm very familiar with the work. I don't want to say I'm a fanboy, but I'm familiar with work. And I know all the work you've been looking at around the issues of copyright and people's freedom or lack thereof to actually be able to change the software and hardware they're using and how that affects people's lives.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that, and I guess if we're talking about things that changed in 2020, is that I've come to understand and make peace with the term IP. Generally speaking, if you talk to copyright activists, they hate the term IP. They say, oh, it's not property, it's imprecise. You're talking about trademarks, you're talking about copyrights. It's hard to tell. Why don't you talk about the thing you're talking about? What I've come to realize is that the colloquial but very precise meaning of IP in a commercial context is any law, rule, or regulation that allows a firm to reach out beyond its boundary and control the conduct of its competitors, its critics, and its customers. And, whether that is anti-circumvention rules being invoked to decide who can perform security audits of products or reveal defects in them, or Goldman Sachs releasing a free font called Goldman Sans that you can distribute freely all you want. It's licensed for free distribution, but it comes with a non-disparagement clause in the license agreement that says that you won't make fun of Goldman Sachs. And so, the nature of IP is really revealed there. They don't need copyright to control who gets to use their font. They need copyright to control what expression can emerge from their font. And, that's funny when it comes to them. But when you see IP being deployed to decide who can fix a ventilator or a tractor, or who can describe the defects in remote proctoring services being used by our institutes of higher education, this becomes a lot more salient, right? There are students who are already at a disadvantage, who, the way that they get their connectivity is by driving to a fast food restaurant and sitting in the car park and doing their remote education that way because of monopolies in telecoms. That means that they can't get broadband or can't get it at a price that makes sense. And now they're being subject to remote proctoring that, because their environment is, quote, anomalous, an algorithm already automatically downranks them and prevents them from proceeding in their education. And so it's as with so many of our technology dysfunctions, if you want to observe what your own future looks like, start with the people who have no power at all, because the terrible technology adoption curve begins with victimizing people who don't get to complain, knocks the rough edges off, and then works its way up the privilege gradient to someone who looks like you and me. 20 years ago, if you were eating dinner and there was a CCTV watching you, it was because you were in a supermax prison. Today, it's because you were unwise enough to buy a home automation system.
Yes. Thank you, Corey. Harry, you want to see if you can follow that on? But at least tell us a little about your work.
Yeah, so I work on privacy networks. We have a sort of system called a mixnet, which is meant to withstand what we call nation-state level adversaries that can watch all the inputs, outputs of the network. And we try to make it so people can be anonymous when communicating, even against what we call NSA level adversaries. Now, I think what 2020 has really shown is, there's truly, I do believe, people in the United States worked very hard to stay within the democratic system. So you saw, I was quite surprised. I've left the U.S. a long time ago. I live overseas. But what I noticed was all of my younger friends, they really got together and they were incredibly enthused about participating in the democratic process. And to be honest, mostly voting for Sanders. Then we saw that strangely overcome by Biden. And we saw an electoral race where the polls claimed for Biden landslide. That obviously didn't happen. Biden barely acted out. And now we're seeing an argument over the legitimacy of the democratic process itself inside the United States. And what that has brought to bear is a number of things. First thing, the United States is obviously not a model for democratic governance in electoral processes that make any sense. All of the ugliness of the Electoral College, the various anti-democratic procedures put into the U.S. governance has all been kind of revealed for all to see. Also, what appears to be a grade, maybe Vinay will address this, a sort of 1970s style voting procedures where votes take days to come in and no one really knows. And then I think what worries me, but also gives me great hope, is that while it does seem like the United States, which previously would make fun of countries that had issues with elections, now appears to be a country which itself cannot run any election and which itself does not have a clear president in the future due to Trump resisting the Biden transition team. This is a situation which in most countries besides the United States, you would say is a setup for a sort of civil war, a setup for a general breakdown of governance. Now, I doubt that will happen. The U.S. military is very strong, but I've been in countries. I was in Egypt when Morsi was replaced by the Sisi coup. The Sisi coup was widely supported by most of the left-wing people in Tahrir Square. And all of a sudden you're in a situation where you don't know who has the right to shut down your telephone. You don't know who has the right to arrest you. You don't know who has the right to come into your house, or it's quite unclear. And then last year, I spent some time in Syria, and in Syria, it's the same situation, except you don't know who has the right to kill you. It's unclear who should be checking your car at various border stops. And I think although this situation seems to be something which happens only in other countries, it's increasingly evident that this may be the destiny of the United States itself. And I do think that the censorship resistance, privacy-based technologies which don't have trusted third parties, which is the point of Web3, I think will have an important role to play both in preserving knowledge, allowing people to communicate when there are nation-state level breakdowns or platform level breakdowns, and could be incredibly important just to maintain our ability to self-organize in the midst of the general sort of decline of the Westphalian nation-state infrastructure. So I'm pretty excited about the future of Web3. I'm pretty bearish on the future of the United States government and nation states in general.
Yeah, it reminds me of the situation with COVID. It's like everything is going to be fine once we have the vaccine, as long as we get that. The other thing that my commentary on that was I was actually watching a TED talk that was done. I'll find the link so we can send around. A few months before the election, and the speaker was talking about what would happen if a president didn't concede. And it turns out that there is actually a way to continue being president if you don't concede. And he lays it out, and it's sort of kind of theoretical, but I hope that's not where we're going, but it's certainly we're off topic here because like we're in the weeds of politics. It is a dangerous situation that we see in right now.
No, I agree 100%. And I think we're going to need technologies like ORCID, like NEM, like Materium and things to rebuild the society, but also to survive what could be a very dangerous transitionary period, which is not something that's constrained to quote unquote developing countries, but which is something now we're seeing in the quote unquote West. And the supposedly stable and core developed countries are now having systemic governance issues.
Yeah. Alan, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and your concerns and your hopes for the future.
Thank you. So my own focus is viewing digital identity as a gateway to data ethics. And particularly this year, I've seen the link that was always there between information and outcomes in democracy becoming absolutely undeniable. So I would argue that information increasingly determines what we believe on the fundamental level, but also what options we perceive as being available. The fact that President Donald Trump is currently refusing to concede, the fact that that is even an option, those seeds have been planted meticulously for a very long time. Then from there, so first it determines what we believe, then it determines what options we think we have available, but then it also ultimately steers what we choose to do. And I believe that online, when we consume information, that information is served to us based on our digital identity. So the more accurate this identity, the more impactful the nudge or the steer towards certain behavior. And in a sense, this is the feeding ground for the current disinformation crisis. And we do see that relationship playing out with politics. So to just take you through like a little timeline, the way we view our information environment and the vulnerability of ourselves therein has definitely evolved. So these are 3 articles, all from The Guardian. And in 2012, they wrote that the headline read something like this. So Obama, Facebook, and the power of friendship. So the 2012 data election. It was 2012, and the usage of personal information was internal, so it was domestic in the context of the US election, but it was also perceived as being benevolent. Then in 2016, that narrative definitely changed. The headline then read, Cambridge Analytica, is democracy itself threatened by tech disruption? So the link was already being made between information and the overall sustainability of democracy. And the angle there became that disinformation was external and it was malign. The Russians are doing it, right? Then in 2020, and this is the reality that we live in right now, the headline read, Putin could only dream of it, how Trump became the biggest source of disinformation in 2020. And what is different there is that the toxicity of information is internal and it is malign. So what we've started to see is that there is a normalization of disinformation into politics. And you can see the systematic conflicts coming out more and more in the information environment, resulting in this really weird situation that there's more information than ever before, but we feel we know less.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the sort of general concept of what is true and how does that belief in the truth or belief that there is some kind of truth is certainly one of the best issues we're facing now with misinformation. Vinay, tell us a little about what you've been up to.
Sure.
What do you think about this one?
So, I mean, the majority of what I'm doing on this front is trying to figure out how to build global courts for commerce. And you don't immediately think, hey, you know, global courts, commerce, what does this have to do with democracy? But my feeling is that we just can't fix democracy inside of the nation state framework. The problem is that we need to migrate enormous amounts of power to the global level so that we can do things like international management of climate. And we have to do this in a way that creates a whole modernized 21st century civil rights framework, because we're still looking at civil rights in much the same way that we did centuries ago in most countries. You know, we haven't figured out things like right to privacy. We haven't figured out things like the rights of future generations to inherit a planet that still basically works ecologically. So I'm definitely kind of wedged far, far in the future, largely because I think the nation state fight for democracy is pretty well staffed and has become a very, very difficult kind of ground and pound operation with, you know, bunches of lawyers and very hard dug in activists. And I'm trying to get a little bit above that fray and say, okay, in 15 years, what are we going to need in terms of global governance? And how do we make sure that when we get that global governance in place, it doesn't turn out to be the worst of the current system, running into this untapped horizon for control that you get as we begin to implement sensible management of long-term climate. The thing that is kind of key to me in this struggle is the notion that if the jurisdictions are the wrong shape and the wrong size, they will inevitably be broken. So, you know, America is kind of too big to work as a democracy if you wind up with gigantic concentrations of power in Washington, D.C., and an electoral system that doesn't adequately represent the interests of people that live in urban areas. Like, okay, it's broken at onset. And you have to go and, you know, really look at these fundamental assumptions around things like the Electoral College. But you come to the UK, you have very similar problems. Only here, the issues in democracy are largely driven by things like land access. We don't really know who owns good chunks of this country. We have enormous amounts of anti-democratic collusion inside of institutions like the House of Lords. So, you know, the thing that I want to drive at here is that over the next century, and we have to be thinking on that kind of scale, technology regulation is going to be the single biggest challenge for global governance. Right? Today, we're still dealing with the fallout from coal plants, which are not exactly high tech. Now we have this enormous problem with these huge seas of toxic data manipulation. Right on the back of that, we're going to have another round with AI. And then behind that, we're going to have questions like who's allowed to mine the asteroids, and what happens if you sling them around and one goes astray. Now what happens? So, to me, I think that the defensive line, like the skirmish line, the main battle is for democracy in the nation state level, and you know we have a lot of forces kind of dug in at that level. But the skirmish line is long-term global and indeed interplanetary regulation of technology. And you know that is basically the domain of science fiction, right? I do a bunch of work as futurist in addition to running Materium. I sketched out an outline of some stuff about this kind of global governance stuff in a sort of throwaway novel I did for National Novel Writing Month about 10 years ago. And what I'm building, although it appears to be a global court for commerce, contains within it the seeds of subsequent courts that could look at things like AI regulation. And you get these kind of global courts to function by forming consortia of technology companies, civil society actors, and various other kinds of agency inside of bodies that have the ability to make law inside of self-regulating organizations. And the bottom line is that if you break those laws, you get kicked out of the SROs. Those kind of structures to me look like they've got the potential flexibility and dexterity for doing long-term self-governance of technology with the hope being that if you could get the technology companies to self-regulate effectively, and I know that sounds like a joke today, but it's not going to be that way in future, you have the potential of keeping this stuff out of the hair of the nation-state governments, who are so inept at technology regulation, they just hand the entire thing over to lobbyists. So, this stuff is still very written on water. It's very, very, very light and speculative. But that's really where I'm focused. How do we build global courts with jurisdiction in specific areas, largely using the framework from the 1958 New York Convention on Arbitration, which gives people the ability to create private courts? And it's definitely walking a razor's edge. This work is, it's okay in the hands of people that are good. In the hands of people that are bad, it will be very dangerous. And I feel like we're in a race against things like, take your pick for the potential venues that we could see instead of these kind of approaches.
Thanks, Vinay. As you're talking, it joined a couple of questions from just thinking through what are going to be big political issues of the century. We're already facing a bunch of things that we're thinking about with global pandemic and immigration, sort of the collapse of superpowers and the emergence of other ones. European Union. We have the list of these things, and in the end, a number of things I've read just basically said all this will matter, but what's really going to matter this century is climate. And at some point, that is just the defining moment for essentially all political parties. And we start to see this already with situations like Syria, and then emigration from a region that has not just conflict, but also climate issues, and then how that then affects, for example, the composition of German democracies and German parliamentary situations, where you start seeing more right-wing emergence as more immigrants start coming in. So I wonder, kind of in your work, is that something you're thinking particularly about as the emergence of climate as a strong issue people are going to have to start paying significant attention to?
So the thing about climate is we just don't have any governance which is the right shape to handle climate. We got nothing. The UN is a joke when it comes to these kind of issues. You could potentially see some kind of deal between the European Union and China, and then if they can drag India into that, they've got about half the world's population, about half the world's economy. But we just don't have anything like the kind of representative structures required. And there is some technology that might help with this. David Chaum, who's obviously the father of digital cash, one of the great godfathers of cryptography, has put a ton of work into a thing called random sample voting. And the basic idea is that if you have an accurate global voters roll, then you can randomly pick people using cryptographically secure sources of randomness, and then you can contact those people and ask their opinions. And if those opinions are sort of 60-40 weighted or something like that, you might only need a sample size of 10,000 people to give you a truly statistically certain perspective on what the world thinks about an issue. The closer you get to 50-50, the more people you need to ask. And you're obviously never going to start that game with a perfect global voters roll. But if you wind up with a global voters roll which is 3/4 of the population and is, say, connected to their mobile phones, you can then apply statistical models to try and guess what you do with the gaps in the data. And if the uncertainty in the data gaps is larger than the measured certainty of the population's opinion, you just wind up having to put a question mark on it and saying we need more data, we need a better voters roll. So those sort of approaches to me look like the possibility of the radical reinvention of democracy at the global level at affordable cost, based on principles like sortition, which we use for things like jury trials. And a global body based on that principle would initially largely be advisory. It's got no power, but in the longer run, right, if that global advisory body makes better decisions than the nation-state governments, you could see the emergence of political parties that dedicate themselves to voting in alignment with that global body. And I think those approaches are definitely in the domain of science fiction, but people like David Chaum are the kind of people that take science fiction and turn it into reality at scale. And I think that those kinds of radicalism we have to put a little bit of work into that skirmish line so that if we win the battle in the short run, we've got the ability to take the next step forward. And likewise, if we lose the battle, we have a rallying point, which is 20 years in the future relative to where the nation state's understanding of the problem is. I'm not saying this in like instead of the nation state level fight that we're all involved in, but I think there are future horizons for the struggle for human decency in the face of human stupidity and evil.
Thank you. So I guess when we think about democracy, we're both thinking about the actual mechanics of how democracy works, like how voting works, how government works, things like governance. But we're also thinking about the things that influence democracy and can subvert it, can take it in a direction which is something which we think of as no longer democracy. Such as the sort of one-party state or an oligarch, or these kind of different of structures. And so, as we think through both these two things, so let's first of all look at things that can disrupt a democracy, whether it's misinformation. We've touched on these things a little bit so far already. And manipulation of media, manipulation of information, maybe censorship, in the sense that sometimes censorship seems a good thing for democracy, sometimes it's a bad thing for democracy. Maybe we can touch upon sort of the behavior of Twitter during this the last few months, and the extent that they've been shifting from being seen as, a publisher or not a publisher, and are they a platform, which one of these things are they when they're adding in the editorial feed. Because currently for those who are opposing the previous regime, or hopefully the regime, might think that these bikes were good. But what if these comments were on candidates that you liked? Like, what if it was the other way around? What if the platforms were being controlled in a different way? So if each of you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on the sort of the threats to democracy and how and the process of democracy, and how Web3, these decentralized techniques or other techniques can help. And then also the sort of the mechanics of democracy, the aspects of voting and governance and so on that Web3 can enable, because that's certainly an area that it seems a lot of promise so far.
Maybe Corey, you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. So I think that we live in obviously a very technologically intensive moment, and there are a lot of really hard questions about surviving from day to day and moment to moment that we can't individually resolve. To know whether or not you should get a given vaccine, or whether you should wear a mask, or whether your kid's distance education curriculum is sufficient, or whether you should get on a 737 MAX, or whether the reinforced steel joist over your head is made of a sufficiently strong alloy that your roof isn't going to fall in on you. These are all questions that, like, maybe smart people could figure out the answer to themselves if you really sat down and bore down on the books and read a lot of articles and meta reviews, but you couldn't answer all of them, right? Not if you live to 150 years. And so we rely on these external mechanisms where the process is legible, right? Where you have truth-seeking exercises in democratic states, where neutral third parties adjudicate contradictory claims from the different experts, and then try to cut through them and tell you what they think is true, and also recuse themselves when they have conflicts and so on. And as that process is broken down, and I think that we can all point to examples in which it's broken down in really ghastly ways. I mean, the opioid epidemic would be a good example, or 737 MAX, our ability to know what is true, in fact, our ability to know how we know something is true, has broken down. And I think this is the great threat to the idea of a polity, of a democracy, because as you replace a legible process that tells us what's true with nothing, people just flail around. I mean, you can't go through the world not knowing whether or not you should vaccinate your kids, or whether or not you should get on a 737 MAX. You have to form an opinion. And in the absence of an institution you trust, we tend to fall back on these personality cults. And we end up just finding someone who sounds like they know what they're talking about and trusting that they're getting it right. And this is a dire threat to democracy. I mean, when we look at the growth of conspiratorial beliefs, including conspiratorial cults like QAnon, we tend to focus on the outlandishness of their beliefs. But really, the more interesting and important question is how they arrived at them. And, there are some people who say that they got there because Google invented a mind control ray to sell you a fidget spinner, and then Robert Mercer stole it and made everyone racist. But I think a more, testable, disprovable, and evidence-supported explanation is that conspiracies arise out of the direct experience with corruption. That corruption and conspiracy are just two sides of the same coin, and that trauma makes conspiracy seem especially plausible. And if you've lost a loved one to the opioid epidemic or to the disastrous British plan to create herd immunity in the early days of the pandemic, or any of the other things where monopoly and a lack of attention to evidence has collapsed trust in our institutions, then you are traumatized. And, a planet of traumatized people who don't know how to know whether something is true, who don't even have a framework on which to agree, the basis on which they would adjudicate a contradictory claim, is no place for a democracy. It's no place where democracy can take hold. And so I think we need to strike at the root. And Vinay, you had some interesting suggestions for exotic voting systems and so on, which I think are all very good and interesting. But, I would settle for like procurement guidelines that just said no government agency is going to buy a product from any company unless they promise to forswear all legal tools they could use to block interoperability and security auditing. Like that would go a long way. We had this chance when the NHS was debating whether or not they were going to put like buttons on NHS pages, where they concluded that they wouldn't, which, probably the right call. But they could have instead done what the Obama administration did with YouTube, where they said, look, we'd like to continue the president's fireside chats that he started as a campaigning senator with YouTube, but White House privacy rules don't let us do it because you harvest too much data. And YouTube responded by saying, "Great, here's a version of YouTube that doesn't gather any data. If you just put YouTube no cookie into the start of the URL instead of YouTube, you will get YouTube with no data collection." We could have done the same thing with the NHS. We could have said, "Give us a like button that only collects data when you share it." And so that I think is a lever that we could use to improve some competition and get us free of this epistemological chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually let me just make one or two little comments. So I was in the room when Dave Ricordan pushed through the Facebook like button. I had to sign an NDA, so I'm not going to talk about it. But at the time, I was working on interoperability, and we sort of had this theory that maybe the like button could share data with all sorts of different kinds of people. It ends up it didn't have to. And we didn't think it was going to have we did not at the time predict what huge amounts of influence Facebook and social media would have. And but that being said, I would like to push back a bit on what I call the fake news narrative that's somehow special to Facebook. It's really clear Facebook is very good at spreading disinformation. I'm not going to argue with that. But nonetheless, so is television. I am from the South of the United States. My parents voted for Obama, and they also voted for Trump in 2016. And the reason is very simple. They believe, and I think the media establishment has not fully reckoned with this, that the Iraq war was the giant movement of what they considered mass media manipulation and disinformation. And that's true, right? We went to war with yellow cake? I mean, it was ridiculous. And I think a lot of people got severely distrustful, people who are not necessarily, ordinary people. My parents, you could, barely, not even use a mouse very well, became very distrustful of television and of mainstream media. And they went to Facebook because Facebook presents different kinds of facts, some of which are more correct. For example, they discovered what actually, the connections between Halbert and all of the stuff was discovered by them on Facebook. And I think while I do believe that there is tremendous responsibility on these large platforms, they're private entities. It's going to be very hard to force them to change, to restrict them. You can use monopoly law, something that's highly unlikely to work. We live in a global world, as Vinay pointed out. And second, the fundamental problem of fake news is actually a problem which we've had since the beginning of radio, which is propaganda. And the reason why we're seeing propaganda more and more in the United States is because we're all now a little bit more on the receiving end of it than we used to be. But if you go to anyone who lived anywhere outside the United States, or at least Western Europe, of course, there was lots of propaganda done by the United States to other countries over television and radio. So I think what's happening is that this whole process, which predates the internet, of spreading information, trying to make decisions about it, trying to understand it, siding with your tribe, forming democratic governance with other people, this has now just become global. And it does have highly centralized points of control. And I do think by decentralizing it, using Web3 technologies, we can create more community-enforced standards, community-enforced governance, and less, I would say, easy to corrupt institutions and technological infrastructure. So rather than restrict internet access or encourage content moderation, which is just another word for censorship, I think we should just call it what it is. And maybe censorship is okay sometimes if you think it is, and it's your platform, but maybe we should encourage people to have their own platforms, their own decentralized processes, their own processes, which may or may not agree with what we want, but it might be what they want. And I'm okay with that, because I think if you look back on things historically, I think the vast amount of propaganda has not come from Facebook. It hasn't come from Putin. It came from the United States government over the Iraq War. And I will draw that line in the sand. And I think that's what led to Trump.
Let me push back a little bit on that. So I agree with some of your points, but I do think that the strength of a lie or any spin depends on the effectiveness of reaching a person most likely to actually believe that lie or spin or other version of the truth. And I think that part of it's a bit sad, really, but part of the reason why the status of democracy, particularly in the United States, is now so dire is that we are seeing a gradual hollowing out of institutions, which is due to many, many, many factors, partly due to the polarization in politics, and their respective bases. But it's also can partly be ascribed to what Vinay was already saying, that we are facing problems on a global scale, and that the institutions as they currently are unfortunately not equipped to react to that. We see it with COVID. We are living in a globalized world. You cannot all of a sudden retract back into nation states and organize responses from there. It has to have a global element. You see it in climate change. And we don't know where the next global crisis is going to come from. But we definitely need to make sure that the structures from an institutional level all the way up to the tech that enables that, and the public buy-in that underpins that. We need to make sure that is future-proof. Otherwise, the future will inform us of our mistakes down the line.
In fact, if I can build on that, I think that the underlying diagnosis is that what we're seeing is future shock. The institutions are unable to adapt to the rate of change, particularly from this combination of globalization on multiple different fronts, the internet, container shipping, and so on. So you have, extremely accelerated globalization, and then you also have extremely accelerated technological change. And what we're discovering is the institutions are just unable to act because the rate of change of the institutions is so much slower than the rate of change in the world. And the oldest institution that we have is 4-year representative electoral democracy, where people come and put X's on pieces of paper. I think the only thing older than that might be jury trials. So, this notion that what we have is institutional tearing produced by a rate of change that they can't manage, that was commonly understood inside of the esoteric bits of the Department of Defense more than a generation ago. This idea that the OODA loop of reality, was just moving faster than the department could adapt to, created an enormous amount of transformation. There was this whole thing, the revolution in military affairs, which was an enormous, almost intergenerational project to try and figure out how to deal with technological change. But the rest of government didn't have that. And, that problem of we just have no, we almost need this embassy of the future, right? We need some ability to have some part of every country which says, okay, our relationship is with the future. We are the 20-year embassy. We're the 50-year embassy. We're the 150-year embassy. Because we don't build political machinery for interfacing with the future, we're just going to wind up with these archaic institutions that are so unable to react to the world that we're in and the world that we're going into. They're stuck in perpetual failure. And then you get the perpetual cover-up of the perpetual failure, and the perpetual cover-up winds up enforced by the damn police state, and off you go to the races. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Stalin and Mao, covering up failure was a critical function of those governments. Corey?
Yeah, I want to push back a little bit. I mean, I want to say that while there are definitely impedance mismatches between the speed at which our institutions work and the regulatory questions that they face, that I've been hearing the story that lawmakers make bad tech law because they're old and irrelevant for 20 years now. And I don't recognize it in the field, right? I have been in the room when bad tech policy was made, and it wasn't because of the elderly irrelevance of the lawmakers involved. It was because they were being unduly influenced by industry and didn't have a source of independent expertise. Lawmakers with no particular technical expertise navigate matters of life and death every single day. The reason you're not dead 1,000 times over of cholera is because a bunch of lawmakers, none of whom is a molecular biologist, still manage to create policy that keeps your water safe. And so I think that it lets them off too easy to say that the problem is that they're old and lack the context and expertise. I think that they know how to make good policy. They choose not to make good policy because their incentives are aligned to make bad policy. The reason that the FDA let the Sacklers sell enough OxyContin to kick off the opioid epidemic and kill 200,000 Americans more than died in the Vietnam War was not because they lacked the capacity to evaluate the strength of the evidence about the safety of opioids. It's because they chose not to exercise that capacity.
So, this is the two great theories of why the world is broken, right? You can either have evil or you can have incompetence, and I think we both believe that it's a pretty good mix of each. As for, how this is going to roll, let's remember that this is not just a US problem, right? The European Union, although it seems superficially to be doing much better than the US in terms of democracy, is probably only 5 or 10 years behind the US in having, large-scale right-wing meltdown. China has just seen a position where they had a somewhat pluralistic top tier of government implode into a kind of dictator for life situation. This stuff is not restricted to the US ecology. And part of why I think that it's largely driven by rate of change is the fact that it seems to be everywhere simultaneously. Even in the non-democratic countries, we seem to be going through institutional failure and collapse. And I do want to very much stress that this is a two-fight situation, right? There is an immediate problem, which is exactly the kind of territory that you're talking about, and then there's a 15 years out kind of frontier where we need to get at least some of the basic moves sketched out early, because 15 years passes in the blink of an eye. And I think we do have to fight on both fronts. We have to fight here, and we have to fight a generation out.
All right.
Speaking of a blink of an eye, Stephen, what's your...
Yes. I'm going to try to wrap this up a little bit, everybody. I could probably talk to all of you for another hour or two because it's fascinating conversation.
Started.
Yeah, so some really good minds and some good opinions here. I was going to ask each of you, because this year seems to have been such an acceleration of history. I was going to ask each of you to try and close, if you can, by very quickly. If you're from the future, looking back at 2020, and sure, you can have the obvious things like the pandemic and so on, but what's the one thing that changed in 2020 if you're looking back from the future? And then we'll wrap it up. Corey, you're up.
All right. I want to preface my remarks by saying that as a science fiction writer, I'm keenly aware that people who claim to know the future are either kidding you or kidding themselves, or possibly both. So
Right.
that said, I will say that my hope is that 2021 is the year in which people who are being harmed by monopolies in lots of different ways, whether that's because the cost of their eyeglasses have gone up 1,000% since one Italian company bought every eyewear brand, or because there are only two major brewers left in the world, or the big four accounting firms keep letting companies like Carillion barrel towards to collapse, or what have you, that they all realize that what they're interested in is not accounting fraud or beer or professional wrestling or eyewear or the future of the web, that they're all interested in monopoly, and that they actually are all fighting on the same fight, in the same way that at a certain point we tipped over from people thinking that they cared about owls or whales or the ozone layer, and realizing they cared about the ecology and that they were all on the same side.
Thank you.
I would just say that.
I think that's Harry.
I'm sorry. I would just say that 2020 is the year in which we finally saw, I think, the U.S. hegemony peak. We saw capitalism itself decelerate, and it's really make it or break it for our generation to put together both the political and the technical infrastructure that I, hopefully coming from the future, will have to live in. And I am confident this generation and Generation Z can actually do it. So I'm actually, despite that I'm worried about what's going on, I'm very positive about the capabilities of using the internet to have the younger people in the future, our future selves, solve these problems.
Great answer, thank you. Owen?
I think looking back, we're going to see 2020 as the year where our problems kind of outgrew nation states. And I do think that from here onwards, we will see global problems that are more and more interconnected, and democracy and nation states, as we currently know them, will be less and less able to react to them. I do think that's a tipping point.
Okay, and thank you. And finally, Vinay.
Yeah. So, I used to work pretty closely with governments, specifically on large-scale disasters, including pandemics. And I was appalled by how just completely crappy and incompetent government planning was for more or less any large-scale problem, from earthquakes through to nuclear war. It was all just garbage. And we saw this unfold with Iraq and Afghanistan, where the Western powers killed pretty much 1 million civilians in those wars on cooked-up evidence that was entirely irrelevant to 9/11. And now we've seen, the same kind of combination of evil and incompetence kill, probably by the time we're done, several million people with COVID. Maybe if we get the vaccine thing worked out, it'll be just about 2 million. Globally, probably 500,000 in America. So I think now we've sort of had our final wake-up call on this combination of evil and incompetence, which is at the heart of government. We have to go and clean this thing out like an abscess or a root canal. Because if we don't get that thing fixed, the next thing around the corner is only going to be worse than the current one. The pressure from climate, the pressure from AI, the pressure from any one of a number of unanticipated risks, it's just going to increase and increase and increase the need for nimble, agile, accurate governance. And to me, the big danger to democracy here is the efficiency of regimes like Singapore, where they have a state which is, generally speaking, on the side of its people, as long as the people don't have too much to say about how they want things to be, right? They're generally well-intentioned. It's a very Confucian kind of situation, but it's so outperforming other governments on so many fronts, and it's not the only example of that kind. So I kind of feel like if we don't figure out how to get an agile democracy that's capable of coping with things like COVID, increasingly you're going to see people kind of taking a look at the autocracies and just being like, those guys have a couple of things worked out. And the recent climate pledge from China, if I remember correctly, carbon neutral by 2050. It doesn't take too much more of autocracies showing that kind of global leadership for us to lose democracy as a principle. So we really need to treat this as a fundamental, enduring crisis of democracy, and we need to be relentless about upgrading it until the democracies perform so well that nobody is even tempted by autocracy. It's going to be a big, big time.
It's a fascinating question to end this on. I'm going to wrap this session up. Thank you so much. It was fascinating talking to all of you and hearing your ideas and the interactions. And I want to thank our hosts for having us here, and look forward to talking with each of you soon. Thank you.
Splendid. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. What a fantastic panel that was. Thanks so much to Seven and all of the other panelists. This probably underlines what we're all pretty aware of, that the technology of democracy clearly needs some work. That I think I take away from that the problem, the challenges that we are facing now is something that transcends nation states, and that another element I took from that is that a crisis such as the pandemic is perhaps should be sort of a driving force to introduce greater agility and clarity, decisiveness into our Western democracies. And in particular in our Western democracies, that we need to be very careful that the commercial forces that operate, the commercial lobby, as well as just the commerciality of many platforms, doesn't entirely jeopardize the notion of an independent truth in our digital commons. And so, it's not only a fundamental crisis that we're facing, but one that is enduring, one that suggests we neglected our peril. And to kind of underline that, I stumbled into a data point the other day, which is just that it was from a firm called Morning Consulting, and if you took the proportion of Republicans coming into the US election who believed in the legitimacy of the electoral process, it stood at 68%. And now afterwards, with the narrative being perpetrated by the Republicans, indeed the Trump administration, about election fraud, it had fallen, it plummeted to 34%. And so regardless of what you think of the outcome of the election, the myth, is it that needs to be fact-checked, of the election fraud has taken hold and has a fundamental impact on our democracy if we are not careful. So we're going to now take a short break. Hopefully you can grab a coffee, rapidly check your emails. It's super short. Please come back here for 2 p.m. So it's just a few minutes. We're going to be looking into a new topic, going postal on mail-in votes. The future surely must be digital. Meantime, if you get a chance, by all means, check out Fabric Ventures and our great companies that we've invested in, the great founders that we've backed. And there should be a booth actually in the virtual expo on the CogX platform. And please, and probably first and foremost in some senses, please network amongst yourselves, chat amongst yourselves, and get some conversations going. Okay, bye for now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Hacking Democracy, which is indeed brought to you by Fabric Ventures in conjunction with CogX. I am Richard Muirhead, Fabric's managing partner. We're an investor in this open web, open economy space. It's great to welcome you from wherever you're joining us today. And in this next session, we're going to reflect on something that I think even the most lay observer can note, which is that counting ballots by hand couldn't be much more analog. And we saw it at the turn of the century in 2000. We also saw it just recently. Now we get the question of hanging chads back in 2000. We also had now people staring at numbers trying to decipher what had been written, but or even debating how close observers should be with their binoculars to observe the actual count itself. And with the rest of our lives, increasingly digitized, indeed dependent on digital platforms, surely the voting system is ripe for some kind of update. So in this next session, we're going to explore that. And I'm delighted to welcome Sebastian Couture, who is the host of the Epicenter podcast, which I must say has something that has been very welcome as my running partner around Hyde Park now for many years. And he's going to introduce a panel of most esteemed experts and get a lively conversation going, I'm sure. Sebastian, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Richard. And I'm glad I can make your run more enjoyable. So we are here today to talk about, what Richard was introducing earlier, which was this very analog process of counting votes. And it does seem quite analog given the technological innovation that has just exploded in the last 3 or 4 decades. I'd like to welcome our panelists for this conversation. They are academics, activists, engineers, political scientists, and experts in this field. We're going to be talking about liquid democracy, digital voting, and so on. So I'd like to actually get our panelists to introduce themselves. So if we could bring them up on the screen, and we'll just do a round of introductions first before we get into this conversation. Perhaps directly to my right on this screen. John, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Nash. I'm a fellow at Demos. We're an independent cross-party think tank, and I work on democratic innovation here.
I'm Santi Siri. I've been an activist, hacker, developer, trying to figure out how to do digital democracy since 2012 with several pilots and experiments in my back, and looking forward to this discussion and this panel.
Hello, everyone. I am Gramatia Kotsialou, and I am a fellow in the Department of Mathematics in the London School of Economics and Political Science. The last 3 years, I have been working on liquid democracy and in blockchain voting.
Hi, everyone. I'm a professor of economics at King's College, London. My interest in this topic is because I've been working a lot on strategic voting games. So basically applying game theory to voting. I've done a lot of work on equilibria and so on. And my interest here is because I've been working on voting and innovations in voting, systems that you can have with blockchain. Thanks.
And of course, you are Amrita Dhillon. So I'd like to start off by, right off the bat, getting sort of an assessment, your assessment of what is the state of the democratic process in, let's say, the G20 countries, and which of these countries are driving innovation in the space of digital voting and the liquid democracy space, as a form of more direct suffrage for policy making?
So I can go on that first. We have that the vast majority of democracies around the world operate through a representative democracy system, where every member of the electorate can vote for a candidate to represent them in the parliament, Congress, etc. So that system was introduced many, many years ago when it made complete sense to do that. For example, the populations were too big in order to have an agora-like assembly where anyone could just turn up to vote. However, now we have the rise of the internet, and this system to elect a government seems every year more and more outdated. So we have that more and more services go online. So why voting is still not there? So therefore, in the recent years, I believe that a kind of direct democracy where everyone can vote on a specific issue becomes more and more popular. And Switzerland, for example, is a good example for combining some type of representative and direct democracy, because I think they give some votes to people, so some referenda in specific topics to vote on. However, for UK, I think they has been coping a bit less well with this combination. So we can see that also from the EU referendum. Estonia also is a country that is some type of example in digital voting, as they allow citizens to vote online. However, they also have the backup process for a paper ballot election at the same time.
I'd like to chime in. Usually when the discussion goes around introducing technology in an electoral process, very rapidly that can go into a discrete where it's technology yes or no, like a binary choice. And in reality, it's really a spectrum. How much technology and where do we apply technology? It's interesting if you go back in history. For instance, the origin of IBM in the 19th century as a tabulating machines company, it was created as a company to actually tally the US election. That back in the 19th century, it could take as long as several months to actually count the votes. So IBM was born out of a need to address the scalability of figuring out fraudulent votes on a national election. If we go closer to our times, an interesting case is India. Speaking of G20 countries, India is the largest democracy in the world, 800 million voters. It has an election that lasts for 6 weeks. It takes a long time to count those votes. And since 1994, they actually introduced an electronic device to put the input of the ballot. This is a very simple device, closer to a calculator than to a computer. So it reduces the cost of auditing the technology. But an interesting fact is that until then, on every election in India, an average of 200 people died because of the violent events, ballots being stolen, ballot boxes being burned, all kinds of events that happen in such a big country like India. Since '94, the deaths occurring on electoral processes have gone to near zero. And in last year's election, it was the first election in India's history that had more women voters than male voters for the first time in history. And that's a consequence of introducing some degree of technology into the process. And I think we have to start paying attention to how we can use civic tech and blockchain-based tech to improve the quality of electoral processes.
There's a great quote by Leo Strauss that comes to mind here. He said that political science fiddles while Rome burns, and they're excused by two things. They know not that Rome burns, and they know not that they fiddle. And so I'm somewhat less optimistic about the answer to this question, in that I see a lot of fiddling. Representatives giving citizens, say, 1% of the budget in participatory budget exercises, or remote cantons in Switzerland exercising broad direct democracy. And I would like to see more, but I don't think we've quite arrived at a comprehensive answer. I think once we figure this out, then we can start to see movements in this direction. But in terms of the state of play today, it's not great.
I tend to agree with that. So, with regard to the question about which countries are at the forefront of innovations, actually what we see is that although there has been some social science research on how electronic voting can improve outcomes. So one is the case of Brazil, where an economist, Thomas Fujiwara, showed that the fraud measured by the number of residual votes goes down, and health spending on especially for the poor goes up. So it had some clear benefits there. And in the case of India too, there have been studies showing that, of course, Sandy mentioned the violence, but there have also been studies showing that ballot stuffing, which used to be a big feature of elections when they were held at without these electronic voting machines, that has gone down tremendously. On the other hand, in some developed countries like the Netherlands, they have actually reverted from electronic voting to paper ballots. So obviously there are deep fears about hacking of these of electronic voting. So I think one of the big questions is how we can ensure that voters trust the system of electronic voting.
Thank you for those answers, and I'm kind of comforted to see that there's sort of both sides here. One that's perhaps more optimistic, and one that sees things perhaps in a more pessimistic light. But that'll make for, I think, for a good debate in this conversation. Was during this answer was mentioned some of the benefits of electronic voting. One was the reduction of ballot stuffing, voter fraud, obviously more access to underprivileged populations, etc. I believe in India, these electronic voting machines are even carried into the forest and into the deep the deep forests of India to deliver them to people so that every single participant can vote, which is great. But looking more at the broad benefits of direct digital voting and just to a broader extent liquid democracy, what are the incentives here for the different stakeholders in democracy? That is, individuals, voters, but also governments, and to a third extent, corporations that also participate in our democracy to some extent.
In my personal experience, when I did activism back in Argentina, along with some colleagues and friends, we did a political party, and we tried to change the system from within. My conclusion after several years of political activism in Latin America is that if you want to be successful in that system, it's more likely that you will end up being changed by the system first. You will end up becoming yourself an efficient player of a system that tries to persist and be preserved throughout the decades and throughout the centuries. My philosophy today, it's a personal take, is that we rather figure out how to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And in that regard, the rise of blockchain networks or trust networks that allow for the creation of new kinds of entities, for instance, the creation of distributed autonomous organizations or entities that are operating cyberspace, that do not rely on any traditional jurisdiction and execute their decisions by means of smart contracts. It's an entirely new canvas to explore governance and what governance is in the 21st century, that does not need to ask for any kind of special permission. And it just takes a new generation to start piloting and trying and experimenting with this new technology. And that can work for public goods and for private entities as well.
Yeah, I see several good features of a system like liquid democracy. For example, in referenda, which Gramatea mentioned, for Switzerland, there are referenda where, for example, there was the Brexit vote. There are various policies that the government might want to take on how to control coronavirus, and in all of these, I think that the role of being able to delegate votes to people that you think know more than you, that should be a good feature of liquid democracy. This is something that I've worked a bit on. And, what we show mathematically is that actually the information aggregate, it is possible to construct mechanisms of liquid democracy so that information is better aggregated in large elections.
I would like also to mention here that thanks, Santiago, for sharing your experience with trying to change the system from within. And I would like here to say that there are more and more people in academia that they are getting into the exploring the liquid democracy mechanisms. So I believe that will be very helpful and is going to have some good results that we can rely on later of how we can move something like that into practice. I also believe that one of the main ways to do something like that is the blockchain technology. So this technology could potentially move politics into the 21st century. And there are many projects and teams that they are looking into that, of how you can create a secure and trusted online voting systems. And that's mostly to create the trust for the public to trust the online voting systems. And as I said, using this technology, could help us implement some type of liquid democracy, and that should also allow the political system to be more fluid and hopefully quicker to react to influential people that might act maliciously, because we might not have to stay with representatives for 4 or 5 years. And of course, at the moment, there are some examples of companies or projects that they use or they have done some experiments on liquid democracy without using blockchain technology. For example, there was an experiment on running liquid democracy in Google. However, in that cases, you have to trust the election authority behind that, so the company in that context. But using the blockchain technology, the election running could be just distributed to various stakeholders, including the whole electorate themselves.
So this is a question that we come at sideways or from a different perspective. So at Demos, we've got a big paper that's publishing tomorrow proposing a concept called combined choice, a way of thinking about democratic decision making that argues that throughout history, at least the last 30 years, the digital revolution, digital technologies have had a fundamental effect where they've on sectors from whether it's finance to music, whatever it is. And so when we think of digital voting, that always feels like a fairly superficial cosmetic change, when the more interesting question is, what's the fundamental change? And so the argument that we make in this paper is that we need to move away from a system that looks at laws and decisions individually, incrementally, right? This is a byproduct of sort of 900-year-old system of putting forward a proposal and making a yes or no decision, and to look more holistically at the law. So while someone like Lawrence Lessig argued that we should think of code as law for the way that it structures society, our argument is the other way around, that we should think of law as code. Now, not write it as code or make it machine readable, but think of it as the nation's operating system. And so the proposal we're putting forward continues that logic out and says, if we take all of the rules that structure society and we bundle them together in one place, then suggestions of change, ideas can be put forward as an alternative version of that bundle rather than as an incremental yes or no decision. And our group of decision makers, whether it's every citizen or a smaller group, can choose the bundle of stuff they want, and the one with the most support is adopted. And this is something we're putting into practice with a housing estate in East London, and we hope to soon be used in Birmingham to make various local level decisions. And so in relation to this debate, the point isn't to say, how can we use technology to do this one surface level thing within our system, but how can these digital technologies change the way the system works? And that's what's always happened. And so we're confident that approaching it in that fundamental way will produce surprising and unusual results.
I like this idea of looking at democracy as a technology stack, and there are different components in that stack, and you may upgrade one component, like you may upgrade the kernel on your system, right? Or you might upgrade certain software, and voting is definitely one of the components in that broader stack. One of the things that was brought up, during this last segment was the idea of trust, and that digital voting systems need to be trusted by the greater population, and perhaps they have suffered from lack of trust. And in fact, this was probably the case in the Netherlands, as was pointed out. Like, what are some of the good standards or good normative properties for liquid democracy systems? And perhaps what are some ways in which technologists, but also just broadly those who are promoting these systems, can help essentially the trust behind them?
There's a well-known paper. Sadly, I will Google it right after my intervention here and try to remember it. But there's a paper that tries to address the problem of voting systems coming strictly from an information theoretic perspective. And ultimately, like, the desirable system for any electoral game is you want a system where you have guaranteed vote secrecy. You want the privacy of the vote to be an element that, so you prevent the coercion of the consciousness of the voter, and the voter can vote freely. Then you have to guarantee the integrity of the vote, meaning that from emission to tallying, you have the guarantees that the vote will be the vote that the voter exactly wanted to vote, that there's no middleman or attack in the middle that will try to change that vote. So integrity is very important. And lastly, the element of verifiability, allowing for the voter to effectively verify that his or her vote has been counted the right way, and that the tally meets the number of voters, and so on. So secrecy, integrity, and verifiability are three key properties for any electoral system. But when you analyze it from a strictly information theoretic lens, and looking at the problem from a mathematical theoretical standpoint, not from real world challenges, the paper comes to a conclusion that it's very hard to reach all three. That you end up having some kind of trilemma where there have to be concessions. You can have a private secret vote, but then guaranteeing the verifiability is not that easy, or there's only 2 out of 3 that you can gather. So it's a very complex problem. It dates back also to Arrow's famous paper on the challenges of elaborating a perfect democratic system, at least from a mathematical standpoint, where we have to deal with the grim reality that the perfect voting system might not exist.
Yeah, to that I can add some other requirements of such a system. One is, we were discussing the blockchain earlier. So one important feature to ensure trust in the system would be to think very carefully about who are going to be the stakeholders. So you have mostly in national elections, you would have an election authority. So if you have this blockchain-based electronic voting system, who are going to be the stakeholders who will control the code and everything else? So ideally, people from different parties who have opposing interests should be the stakeholders. So that's an important question. And the other question the other problem I would add is, from a social science point of view, is that of vote buying, which becomes much easier with electronic voting. And I think Santi did mention that to some extent, that the secrecy of the vote, or to prevent coercion of voters. How do you do that in these systems? And this is where economics and social science can contribute in the design of such systems.
I just found the paper is called An Information Theoretic Model of Voting Systems. If you want to Google it.
Some other good properties of liquid democracy is that it combines the advantages of representative and direct democracy, and in theory could also increase participation. For example, those people that abstain because, let's say, that they don't know what to vote for in continuous referenda, then they might have the option to choose the person that they trust. And that could also happen for different topics. So more knowledgeable people can influence the final outcome. However, if the trust is broken, then citizens could deviate faster than what we currently have their votes to some others. Also about, we might have also the issue of vote buying, but I believe that that also could be a nice mechanism design problem. For example, we know currently that there exist some blockchains that they are anonymous blockchains. So, for example, you don't, if you have a transaction, let's say, of votes towards your, I don't know, favorite trustee, then the person that will receive the votes might not be able to see where these votes come from. So maybe something like that could also solve any potential vote buying problem. But that also, again, it depends on the application, the voting applications that you want. You might have other voting applications, for example, in the corporate system that vote buying, for example, between shareholders is acceptable.
When it comes to this question of liquid democracy, and I'd be interested to hear what Santiago has to say about this, as he's looked at this probably closer than we have. But when we looked at this structure, the big problem that we found came when you try and divide things into different areas. So is something a health question? Is it an education question? Is it a finance question? Is it a budget question? Often it's all of those things. And then, of course, the complexity that emerges as you're delegating. And so we came to the conclusion that liquid democracy isn't a good idea. And that, I wonder what my fellow panelists may disagree, and then in the sort of same exercise, we looked at a lot of blockchain-based ideas. And one thing that struck us was that there is an inherent distribution to a democracy, right? You're asking lots of citizens. And so rather than involve sort of distributed ledgers, distributed computation, a currency, an exchange, all these kind of things, we came to the position that the best form of distribution we could have in a democracy is a situation where the decisions of each person are held in different locations and then aggregated to reveal their preferences. Whether that passes Santiago's 3 tests, I'm not sure. I think that's perhaps impossible, but that's our view. So I'm on the other side of the fence when it comes to liquid democracy.
It's a fascinating topic. I think that one interesting thing about electronic technology is that it gives us a new canvas to advance the game theory on how voting systems work. And we no longer have to be limited to strictly first past the post voting and people raising hands and that's it. We can go many, many steps further, and probably since the rise of the smart contract economy and where there are a lot of governance experiments happening, we are starting to see how these experiments play out. There are several ideas. We have at Democracy Earth experimented with many of these. We have tried liquid democracy in the past. We have seen liquid democracies being implemented in some other protocols. Usually, there's a nice case that I always quote that is called, it's a blockchain project called LISC, and you have the ability to do what it's called delegated proof of stake. It's not exactly democracy because there's no way of formalizing human identity on blockchains yet, but people were voting directly with their tokens or delegating tokens to other participants. And the community ended up having 2 large parties, Republicans and Democrats, all over again competing for the decision-making process. And this is actually a pattern that happens in a lot of token voting schemes on Ethereum today, for instance, where if you look at Uniswap, for example, it has 2 addresses, each holding 32% of the tokens, which means they have 2/3 of the voting power in the protocol, which means that whenever someone goes to a decision in the Uniswap protocol, the only decision makers are those 2 whales. rendering the whole voting process irrelevant, because what whales usually do is they just see how everyone is voting on a decision, and at the last minute or the last block of the blockchain, they just tumble the election according to their own personal interests. So until we don't get a way of formalizing human identity over decentralized networks in a way that is privacy preserving, so we don't recreate Facebook or the Chinese Communist Party, which are essentially the same thing, we still have a very open problem about how to achieve digital democracy in these networks. From the game theoretic point of view, we have been exploring several ideas. An interesting approach we like a lot that gave us good results in Colorado in the United States, where we did a big pilot, was quadratic voting, which is a system where it captures not only the preference of the voters, but also the intensity of those preferences, as the cost for giving your vote to an idea increases quadratically rather than linearly, and that pushes the voter to decide whether he or she will support, with all of his voting power, a minoritarian idea, or with a weak voting power, several ideas. And every election in the world is really a challenge of that, the weak preferences of the majority versus the strong preferences of the minorities. And being able to capture that with novel game theory is really interesting, but at the same time, it's very important in democracy that every player understands the rules. So we still have a long way to go, I think.
That's a great point, and I think it points to something which we were talking about before this started, and I kind of chimed into the previous talk, and I just came in when Vinay Gupta was saying that we need to divorce democracy from the current governmental framework, and I wonder to what extent liquid democracy and the things that we're discussing here and that we're talking about here in this panel are framed in the context of what we know and understand as what a democracy does and should look like. I wonder if this current framework perhaps needs to evolve and is no longer adapted to our current reality. To what extent do you think that democracy itself needs an upgrade at every point in the stack, including this idea of one vote, one person, one vote. One example which was mentioned in the previous panel was statistical models to determine people's interests and sort of broader trends in society. What are your thoughts on some of these ideas as democracy?
Well, it certainly needs to
evolve,
and I like seeing these ideas sort of battle it out. And I think we have to be quite blunt when we're comparing them and testing them and looking at them. The thing that I'm most excited about is this idea of a sort of two-sided network or a two-sided market, where instead of having to go down the quadratic route, or instead of having to randomly select citizens, you've got a group in which people are free to choose the thing they want, but they're also free to propose alternatives. And this is kind of how the free market works. And it produces great results, because if you don't like what you see, you can put forward something else. So the freedom to choose tells us which is best, and the freedom to propose increases the quality of available options. And so I think rather than making democracy more complex for citizens, asking them to do more, we can ask them to do less, but add that second side and improve the quality of what's being decided.
There's a famous president from Uruguay, very loved by everyone in Latin America except by Uruguayans, as usually happens with politicians. No one is a preacher in their homeland. Called Pepe Mujica. Once told me one day that I was able to meet him in Washington. I asked him, well, what kind of advice would you give to a democracy activist? And he said, you're going to get tired a lot, because it's a never-ending process. Democracy is always a working process. If democracy was an absolute idea, a totalitarian idea, it would be pretty much a fascist model of the world, like every other ideology that is out there that gives you a complete idea of the world. Democracy is the one exception. It's the system about how we make decisions, and not necessarily about a conclusion about how the world should work out. So it's always going to be a frustrating process, because it's a process that should have first and foremost the goal of including everyone in a decision-making process, and that takes education, that takes technology, that takes a lot of tools, and I guess it's an ongoing evolutionary process. The good thing is that every government in the world claims to be a democracy. North Korea is called Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the Chinese constitution, it says, like, the second paragraph, China is a democratic dictatorship, whatever that means. So it's interesting that it's an idea that subversive, that can penetrate every government in the world, yet everyone has very different ideas of what it means.
Yeah, I see that this is, the evolving of the evolution of democracy and technology. It's a huge challenge, because the incentives of politicians to implement any of these new systems, which might distribute power more equally among people, is going to be resisted, it seems, a lot. So even if we think, ideally the blockchain might solve the problems of secure electronic voting, or that liquid democracy is much better in this complex world where, you need experts to make decisions. So liquid democracy might be ideally very useful, but it's probably going to be resisted a lot. And so I don't know what the projection is, what we can expect in terms of implementation of any of these technologies.
So what I have to add in all these nice comments that I totally agree with is that some type of liquid democracy could maybe start from smaller scale. So, for example, some trials or from local authorities, as John mentioned before, and from the bottom to the top. So I think that should probably have some type of effect in order to make more people come together for the decision making as well, for their everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, my fear here, my concern, I'd say, is that that there is very little incentive for politicians to implement, new innovations in the democratic system, and the rate at which technology is advancing and the rate at which largely corporations are benefiting from that speed of evolution in technology, that democracy starts to lose its power in the sort of more global order of things, and that we see power falling into the hands of non-elected corporations. And to some extent, this is what we've started to observe. I want to come, just as we start to come towards the end of our conversation here, bring it back to the recent U.S. election. One of the things that stood out to me as I was following this was the extent to which people seem to be so incredibly attached to the democratic process and the framework for the U.S. democratic process, so the U.S. Constitution. It seems almost sanctified, right? That this document that was written, 2.5-3 centuries ago, still is upheld in some sanctimonious fashion. This is the case, here in France, for example, as well. The Constitution isn't nearly that old here, but obviously that has its flaws. The world has changed since then, and I feel that there's a reluctancy to replace the systems that are already in place, and have systems that are more adapted to a modern society. What are some signs that we might observe that things could change in the future, or are we headed towards a more bleak, outcome where we perhaps go more towards conflict than a more just democratic system?
I had a conversation recently with a China analyst, and we were sort of semi-joking that there seems to be these two options between a highly efficient authoritarian regime or a highly inefficient democratic regime. That's like, it doesn't. totally fall into those categories, but that seems to be the kind of the dichotomy. And so I would say that the big challenge, the big exercise is to create the efficient democracy, and that is the nuts and bolts. It is the system, it is the processes, and demonstrating something that works so much better than the system we've got in whatever use case that it starts to spread. Those are my 2 cents.
Every American election to me is an interesting case study on how to exploit democracy one way or another, whether it was Cambridge Analytica 4 years ago or mailing ballots on this year's election. The one thing that we do know is that we usually go to a vote when it's a hard, difficult, conflicting decision. We don't go for a vote for easy choices or easy decisions. So by definition, democracies have to thrive in very hostile environments. And hostile environments means that there will be players willing to cheat, willing to corrupt, willing to take over the election, whatever it takes. So the systems that we build have to be extremely resilient to be able to survive these kind of hostile actors. And the reason we go to democracies is because the higher the risk in a decision, the higher the need for legitimacy in the decision-making process. That's why we choose the route of democracy, to address the need for legitimacy in a very conflicting environment. Democracies are not meant to rule over easy decisions or simple decisions. So in that regard, I think we will keep seeing exploits over democracies every 4 years or every 2 years around the world, as technology also plays an important role in manipulating and setting the agenda. And I know from experience on every pilot we have done in Democracy Earth, we had attempts from hacking coming from governments, coming from activists, coming from insiders of an organization. If the decision is important, there will be exploits.
Yeah, I think I am also quite pessimistic about the adoption of, good democratic practices or changing the current system. As I said before, I think I'm quite cynical about politicians wanting to give up their power. But looking at, how change happens might be a good way to go. So looking across countries to see which ones have adopted better systems and how they did it might be one way to research on this. And what you notice also is the large number of protests that are going on from ordinary people across the world. And one question that that is really standing out for me is when do such protests succeed? And if they do succeed, then I think that gives us a hint about what conditions are needed in order to change democratic processes.
And the one more challenge I can see in all this evolution of democracy is that it is a topic that involves many different disciplines. So it's not only computer science, mathematicians, economists, social scientists, lawyers, activists. So it requires the effort of all these disciplines together. But the good thing is that at least in academia there is some new trend for interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research that I believe that could deal with this, at least with this challenge as well. But there is a lot of way to go.
One of the things that stood out for me here, Santiago, is the parallels between your statements about the attacks on democracy and software. And if you think of the U.S. democracy as software which was written 300 years ago, and the last update happened in 1992 with the 27th Amendment, well, no wonder it's getting attacked with like these very modern exploits, right? That exist in sort of our current reality. Is it safe to say that democracies that don't update at a quick enough pace, right, that don't apply the software patches, are due and are bound to be exploited and whatever consequences that has?
To me, the most salient fact of the week of the American election and of these last couple of weeks is that the rise of the price of Bitcoin and crypto in general is going significantly up in a very fast pace. And that's the strenuous effect of people exiting a system and engaging in something else.
Well, you're being quite generous in referring to it as old software. In the UK, we still write laws on bits of dried animal skin. And so I think the question isn't how we vote, but what we're voting for. And so I would encourage a bigger framing of the issue.
Any last words before we close up here?
I know we've been a bit pessimistic, but I choose not to surrender. You know, it's going a bit to be a battle of generations, and the more we keep fighting, eventually the better things will get. And I think it's an exciting time to be working on technology around this. There's tremendous potential, tremendous creativity being applied to this. And I recover my optimism when I meet young hackers around the world building on Ethereum with Bitcoin and on these new networks that are daring to create a new institutional reality for the world.
Marita, any final thoughts?
No, I think the U.S. election, demonstrated to us how similar the U.S. is to countries like India. I mean, we have, or even Africa. We have coups going on and very similar sorts of problems, which we were really, really shocked to see that the U.S. could have these issues of trust in elections as developing countries have. So. Indeed, many of my friends have mentioned how India could actually help the US by providing them these electronic voting machines to help them next time. So I think maybe there is this convergence happening in politics, if not in economics.
Okay, I think that about wraps up our conversation. We're at the end of our time here. Thank you to all of you for those excellent insights, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future. Richard, I believe you've been muted this whole time.
Sebastian, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't know if I could actually intervene or anything, but yeah, okay, go ahead.
You did very well. And thank you for noticing, even if nobody else had noticed. But all I did was just thank you and the rest of the panel for some great thoughts there. A few bullets that I took away from that were, the data that Santi shared that supports how digitization can reduce the violence in particular in contested elections or decisions, and increase the inclusivity both for women and other minorities. How we've got this trilemma between secrecy, integrity, and verifiability, with an overlay of this question of how to cope with how a digital vote might possibly or conceivably be more easily bought. So maybe that's a quadrilemma of some description. He looked up, I think it is the paper by Hosp and Vora, entitled An Information Theoretic Model of Voting Systems. If people want to, again, be reminded to go and have a look at that. But despite that challenge, I think the panel concluded that that a secure and trusted online voting system and further digitization can move us towards a more liquid democracy, one where perhaps we have an ability to run experiments, different approaches to decision making, get actual kind of, if you will, working running code in the form of pilots operating, and we have many forks currently in the approach to democracy. And again, the panel talked about perhaps even some forms of government that are democracy somewhat in name only. And you could argue that even that is a feature rather than a bug to the way in which a sort of the democratic movement and concept perpetuates. And it's, again, the comment came that it's definitely essential that we don't ossify our approach to democracy in the form of ancient documents that are not updated, let alone moved into the kind of the modern age. So it's an evolutionary process that continues to keep life in our democracies, multidisciplinary, and one requiring a constant watch. So we're going to take a short break again. We're going to be kicking off again actually at 3 o'clock. We'll be looking at the death knell for polls. Are indeed perhaps prediction markets the future? Centralized ones, decentralized ones, more perfect and data-rich ones. There are many people innovating in this space. Meantime, feel free to importantly chat amongst yourselves, finding yourself each other on the CogX platform, and to check out the various great companies and founders in the Fabric Ventures portfolio. Bye for now. Welcome back to everybody to Hacking Democracy, this cog extra that is brought to you by Fabric Ventures. I'm Richard Muirhead, Fabric's managing partner. And here at Fabric, our entire venture investment thesis is based upon the principles of individual ownership of identity, of your personal data, and indeed the very networks, digital networks, upon which our lives have become increasingly dependent. So as we, in these sessions, are looking at how the technology that is democracy might and perhaps must be continuously improved, it's a thrill to be welcoming you here from wherever you happen to be today around the world. So it hasn't been a fantastic month for US pollsters, again, at vast cost in terms of money, and you could argue mis or disinformation. Many companies sought to call the presidential race, but failed, arguably more miserably than they did 4 years ago. Folks are calling for the whole industry to be rethought, rebuilt from the inside out. And perhaps, we will see that happen. Perhaps we will see a move away from the polling industry. And there are alternatives. Would prediction markets, for example, perform better? Ones that source data in a whole variety of other ways, ones that are centralized, ones that are decentralized, and maybe can access better data for that reason. So these are some of the questions that we're going to be addressing in this forthcoming session. It's entitled The Death Knell for Polls, Prediction Markets of the Future. I think I'm just going to go straight ahead and introduce the Chief Executive of Demos, that is Polly McKenzie, who is going to introduce the rest of our expert panel. Polly, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. So I run Demos, which is a UK think tank, and in an age of division and outrage, we exist to build a policy agenda for consensus and positivity and bridge divides. So we do a lot of work around public opinion in order to fulfill that role, which means that we spend a lot of time both doing polling ourselves and analyzing polls. And as Richard says, the US election has been one of those experiences where so much expectation and analysis has led to yet again this big navel-gazing conversation. What went wrong? What can we fix in the future? And is it possible even to create a polling model that can navigate and make sense of this extraordinarily complicated set of opinions and ideas and judgments that people are making about our politics? I'm joined by a brilliant panel who can help us explore that today. So first is Gideon Skinner, Research Director of Ipsos Mori, and Ipsos did a range of polling during the general election, so we can hold him fully accountable for that, but also be a bit more generous to him, I expect. Also, Ethan Singer, and I have got that right. It's very confusing having a panel with a Singer and a Skinner, but never mind. Ethan Singer, who is the strategy lead at Polymarket, which is a predictions market. And also, finally, my good friend and colleague, Harry Carr, who is the research director and our in-house pollster at Demos. So I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to share their kind of opening thoughts, particularly thinking about the US election, but also the wider question of where polling is getting things right, where prediction markets might be offering us different ways of predicting the future. And then we will open out into a discussion and questions. If you have questions, please do post them and I'll be able to share them with our panelists. So as you listen, if you have thoughts, do share them with us. So I'm going to start with Gideon.
Okay. Thanks very much, Polly. And thanks to Cowex and Fabric for inviting us to talk to you all this afternoon. I'm going to try to make 3 points. The first of which is just taking a little bit of a historical look back at polling and the performance of the polls, which is to say that this is not new. Unfortunately, this is not the first time that we've had conversations like this about polling. And indeed, ourselves at Ipsos Mori produced a report 4 years ago called The Death of Polling, with a bit of a question mark behind it. You'll be surprised to know that we didn't think it really was. But actually, if you look at the analysis that Will Jennings and other academics have done on the long-term performance of the polls, there isn't any evidence that polls are getting any less accurate. They're still broadly around the world. Kind of the average error is around about 2 points. And that hasn't changed a lot over recent years. And I'm bound to say at this point, I lead the UK polling, and we were not entirely inaccurate last year. But the fact that it's not new tells us three things. The first thing is that we should expect some uncertainty when we're looking at polls, and I'll come to that right at the very end. It does mean that actually, often there are very specific, country-specific issues that affect polling when it doesn't go so well, and that these can be fixed because they can get better over time. But also it means we need to have some sort of framework for thinking about polling and how it can be improved and the challenges it faces. And broadly, what that means for us is that polling isn't something that just measures society and social opinion. It's something that is affected by changes in society as well. And that means, in particular, how changes in society might affect how easy it is for us to get a representative sample and how easy it is for us to predict turnout, which are affected by social changes like polarization, disengagement with politics, and so on. Thinking about the US polls, secondly, it's too early. The big caveat really is to know exactly how the polls have gone. We're still counting still counting votes. It looks like maybe some of the very early hot takes about the performance of polls are being over hasty. Broadly, it looks like the polls called the Biden share pretty accurately, and overall, in aggregate, got many of the states and calls right. Generally, I think we were at Ipsos US. Our central forecast was a narrow Biden win. And I think most of the polls were putting in many states, if we allow for margin of error, to say they were too close to call. I don't think they were predicting a Biden landslide. But clearly there was an issue with the Trump share of the vote specifically being around about 3 to 4 points underestimated, which has an impact in certain states where some states maybe we thought were too close to call but ended up being reasonable Trump wins, or some states that were we thought were going to be safer for Biden ended up being narrow Biden wins, even if the end outcome was the same. And we're going to have to look at what were the reasons for that. Again, it's got too early to have done all this data analysis, but going back to my original point about a framework for thinking about polls, the sorts of things we'll be looking at are the impact of a very high turnout, whether that had a differential impact on Republican and Democrat voters, the impact of COVID, and specifically the impact of very high levels of postal voting, and if any of those have an impact on the actual sample that we were able to get. So there's still work to do on that to understand that sort of slight underestimation of the Trump vote, and particularly maybe it may even be very specific issues in specific states that we will need to account. Finally, just looking forward about making sure that polls are going to be interpreted better in the future. There's really kind of two things for us here. The first is that I think we need to have both better communication of uncertainty and better understanding of uncertainty. That's partly down to us as pollsters, but it's also about other media commentators and other commentators understanding what uncertainty is and really maybe being bolder when we are saying it is too close to call. And the second point that I think I'd really like to change when it comes to looking at polls is just this real strong focus on the horse race numbers over and above anything else. That's not why I got into polling. It's not what interests me when it comes to polling. What's interesting are all the other data that we get in polls, trying to tell the story of elections, trying to tell the story of what happens in between elections. And I think often there, when you look at that data from polls, we get a better understanding and a much more richer understanding of what's going on in our politics and in our society. And for me, that's the real value of polls. But I'll stop now.
Really helpful. Thank you very much. Ethan, it's often said that polls are not a prediction, which is true and fair. But the good thing about prediction markets is they at least are attempting to make a prediction. Does that make them better at predicting the future? What's your experience of polling market?
So frankly, my view of the election is slightly different than most pollsters out there. Polls are just one piece of the puzzle. They're one piece of the information that's put into the prediction market, the information market. And in the past couple election cycles, we've really seen the rise of decentralized information markets, bringing down the barriers entry into these information markets and getting the wisdom of the crowds from everybody out there, not just a select few. This helps reduce the bias that we see in a lot of the polls throughout the United States and the world generally. But essentially, the prediction markets are able to absorb all the information from the polls as well as a variety of other sources. And as we know, markets are the best information aggregator there is. When people are forced to put their money where their mouth is, you get a lot of you see a lot of different information than when you simply call somebody up and ask them who they're going to vote for. Especially in the United States, there's a lot of division amongst party lines. You end up having people who say they're voting for one candidate simply to just throw off the pollsters. When you have to put money on the line, there's no ability to do that. And if you do that, you end up losing. And the market corrects for people making decisions that just don't make sense. That's why we saw this election, prediction markets, information markets, centralized and decentralized, had drastically different views of what was going to happen this election compared to centralized polling companies and statisticians. I mean, 538, The Economist, they predicted the election 94, 97% chance of a Biden victory. Most people predicted a landslide. And what we saw on election night is that nobody really knew what was going to happen. But what we didn't see is that prediction markets and information markets are able to factor that information in real time, and you can see a live feed of what exactly is going on throughout America as the election votes were counted.
Really interesting. Thanks. Harry, you have spent your whole career thus far doing polling, public opinion research. Do you despair? Is Ethan going to replace you? What do you think?
No, I think there's two kinds of I think there's two kinds of polling which are relevant here. And it's important to note that Demos doesn't do voting intention polling, and the thing that prediction markets definitely can't do is exactly what I'm doing with Demos, which is looking at what public opinion is around things which aren't around voting intention. You can't have a prediction market on how satisfied people are with political leaders or what their views are around any particular policy agenda or what they feel about the world around them. So there's two kinds of polls which are relevant here, and I think neither of them are going to be entirely replaced. Neither of them are going to be dead or completely replaced by prediction markets. One side of that is just not at all, which is things which aren't around that horse race. And even if you take what your takeaway is from the US election and from repeated polling errors over the last high-profile polling errors over the last few years, is that polls are inaccurate by, on a bad year, a handful of points. That still is very, very accurate and useful as information if you're talking about anything at all which isn't voting intention. So on that score, there's a huge amount of use still to be there in polls, even if they're even comparatively bad polls. So if you live in Wisconsin, you must be absolutely sick to death of voting intention polls. They were 7 points-ish off in 2016. They look like being pretty similarly off in 2020, and that is historically very, very far off the average. Polling errors are usually much less than that. But if you're within 7 points on something, on the vast majority of issues in which aren't around voting intention, there's still really useful information to have that. But there's also the voting intention polls, which I think is the primary focus of what we're talking about today, and where prediction markets are something which is a relevant comparator, and where I think there is an open contest about the way that it's best to look at what's likely to happen. The first question would be, were polls that wrong? And Gideon's absolutely right that we don't have the full results yet, so it's difficult to say exactly how wrong they were. I think pretty accurately is an all right reflection on overall. So it looked like they were around 3 points out on a national scale, which is about average in terms of polling errors if you kind of aggregate them across different democracies across time. So it's not a massive error on the national stage. The issue is that in first past the post style elections, like you get in both the UK and the US, comparatively small errors can obviously make massive differences to what that means in terms of who then gains power. And it was extremely close to Biden losing to Donald Trump winning. Only actually, tens of thousands of votes in the key states would have needed to switch for it to be another Trump win, and that was very different from the story that was being primarily told before the election. And the error looks like it's very similar to 2016, which is a worry for US pollsters, and that's across states as well. So in Georgia, there was no problem really in the 2016 election. They got it pretty much right. No one noticed Georgia because it wasn't seen as a swing state then. It was won by Trump by 5 points. This year, Georgia, again, wasn't a problem at all. They got it almost exactly right. Biden was meant to win by a very, very narrow margin, and Biden won by a very, very narrow margin. In Wisconsin, they got it wrong, and they got it wrong in the same direction by a similar amount. And that's true for lots of the Rust Belt, and true for several other swing states. And there is an open question which we don't know the answer to yet, frankly, as to the extent to which the changes that they made from 2016 to 2020, whether they were useful. So one major one was around including education as a thing to include in the sampling and the weighting processes. And that's a thing that was also learned by several pollsters over the Brexit referendum as well, that newly something which had been something you took into account and you kept an eye on, but wasn't necessarily something that you kind of had as key in your quotas and in your weighting, suddenly became something which was very, very predictive of the way you were voting. That was true in the US as well. With Donald Trump, it suddenly became an issue. Pollsters started waiting for that, but other things seem to have moved around. I think another issue is that in UK and US polls alike, that it seemed that doing the same thing as you had previously can sometimes be better than trying to win the last battle. So we saw in 2015 a massive polling error in the UK. And one of the things that some pollsters tried to look at was, okay, let's really shift the way that we're trying to think about things, particularly around trying to predict turnout, to match what we're actually seeing when it comes to elections, rather than just taking people's word for how likely they are to vote. And then 2017, the pollsters who had made the biggest changes to try to basically assume that the turnout would look similar to how it was done in previous elections, got it vastly wrong. And the pollsters who had actually not tweaked much from 2015 did much better. So there isn't a clear, even if you can locate exactly where the error was in the previous election, there's absolutely no guarantee that it will be in the same way in the next election. An issue which is slightly undermined by the fact that it actually was really, really unusually in 2020, and the Trump effect might be a factor there. And it might well be that Trump himself is a reason why the errors are kind of as united in the way as you'd expect. It doesn't look like it's a Republican thing that is always undermining the Republicans. If you look at the 2018 midterms, actually the polls were pretty accurate. And if you look at 2012, actually Obama was underrepresented in the polls. In the same states which have then underrepresented Trump in the polls in 2016 and then again in 2020. And finding out what the issue there is going to be really, really difficult. And even if you find it out, tweaking for that won't necessarily guarantee it's going to be right next time. But I am also skeptical that prediction markets are going to necessarily be any better. They're obviously, for one thing, they assume they are massively, they use polls. Polls are a gigantic piece of data that they will be used as a reason why you are putting your money on the prediction markets. So a sway in the polls is going to make a big difference to the prediction markets as well. And if you just take away polls, that doesn't mean prediction markets are going to be much worse. Would be my opinion. Although I'd be interested to know what Ethan's take on that would be if we suddenly went into a world without polls at all. There's also, and you can see some evidence of this, some issues around who is putting the money in. If you're doing a poll, you're trying to get a nationally representative view, and getting that is really, really difficult. And those are the issues that pollsters have. If you are a betting market, you are getting the opinion of people who have the money and the intention to put their money where their mouth is. And if you looked at the prediction markets over on the night of the election, there was some very stupid money going on Trump when Biden should, by all objective understanding of how the numbers had been counted at that stage, should still have been favourite, even if he wasn't as heavy favourite as he had been at the start of the night. And even when essentially the count had been done, we knew that Biden was going to be president. You could still get about 10 cents in the dollar if you put your money on Trump. So I think putting too much trust into what the prediction markets say would be a worry, and there's questions about where that money comes from. If you suddenly made the prediction markets the be all and end all, and the way that you should definitely look at the way that who's going to win presidential elections, especially in the US where money has such a big deal, that you could easily see that being swayed as well, which puts in another thing which I'd worry about from that perspective. And they're also obviously reliant on polls. So for all those reasons, there's a place for prediction markets. They bring in stuff which polls don't and aren't meant to bring into in terms of trying to work out who's going to win. This is probably a thing worth looking at and bearing in mind, but they can't and shouldn't replace polls of voting intention and are completely irrelevant to most of the polling that I do, which, as Gideon says, is the more interesting stuff.
Thanks very much, Harry. So we've got a question there, basically from Harry to Ethan, around what prediction markets would look like without the input of polls. Do we think that the wisdom of crowds is capable of generating insights without them? But going beyond that, I wonder if we can come back round and explore this question of whether both prediction markets, betting markets, which can up to a point be bought by heavy investment or at least influenced. And there's lots and lots of anecdotes, certainly in UK politics and probably in US as well, of where some of the richer candidate has put money to make the odds narrow in their seat, and therefore then they put out a leaflet that says the odds are narrowing. But also then the broader question of the way in which polls potentially influence turnout, activist enthusiasm, all of this information about what's going to happen in the future, all of these predictions, do they actually affect the outcome? Because, there's an argument put forward by some that all of this predicting is sort of fundamentally anti-democratic because it skews actual voter behavior. What do you think about that kind of soup of issues? I'm going to start with Ethan to respond to Harry's direct question, and then the wider question about influence and impact on actual outcomes.
Definitely. So I think a common misconception with these prediction markets is that money can sway the direction the prediction market is in. That can happen for a very brief period, but what we saw throughout this entire election cycle is we saw some big Trump bets come in, and it moved the market marginally from maybe a 63% chance to a 65% chance. But as soon as the smart money came back in and saw a misalignment, it was brought back down to 63 very rapidly. One whale can come in and move the odds of Trump winning to 99% for 15 minutes, but that's not indicative of where exactly the election is headed. And another interesting point you brought up about where would we be without the existence of polls. So I think definitely polls are important, and they do help gauge sentiment of the public. And in fact, a lot of the predictions that are made on prediction markets and information markets are based off of polls. And frankly, polls do offer an insight to where the public is leaning. In states like Wisconsin, though, the 8-point lead that Biden had, or the 10-point lead that Biden had going into the election, it was obvious on election night that it wasn't going to be that wide in Biden's favor. And watching mainstream media on election night, the American public really didn't know who to believe. You would turn on one channel and Fox News or somebody would be saying Trump is winning. He's winning in all these states. And by the vote counts that were coming in that night, it seemed that he'd been winning a lot of these states that Biden was predicted to win. But then the mail-in voting came in shortly after, and just as someone in the American public looking, you thought Trump really did have a big chance of winning that night. But when you went back to prediction markets, you would see that, okay, Pennsylvania was a 60% chance of Biden winning before, and it's still very similar when it looked like all the Trump votes had come in early and swept it. And then as the week went on, you'd see that as the votes were counted, Biden slowly eked out his win. But it was certainly not a landslide win in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, as had been predicted by a lot of these polls previously. And not to say that these voter polls are wholly inaccurate. I think they just didn't gauge public sentiment previously in the same way that you can given a prediction market. And prediction markets are not necessarily all are monetary based. There's plenty of wisdom of the crowds prediction markets that are just based off of people's opinions. You don't have to put your money there, but those are arguably a bit more influenceable. although they have gleaned some very important insight, simply because when you have thousands of people, if a few people go in one direction, you still end up with very valuable information.
Really interesting. Gideon?
Yep, thank you. So I suppose I'd kind of just very briefly, I mean, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on polls versus prediction markets. I sort of slightly take issue with the fact that the two are comparable, in that I think they're just different things. I think it's a slightly sort of category mistake to compare one with the other. They're different things, and it's clear that clearly prediction markets do take into account polls, but it should be absolutely should be obvious in theory that prediction markets have the opportunity to take in lots of other information and data over and above polls. In some ways, the interesting question is, given that you would think in theory prediction markets should always be vastly better than the polls. The question is, so far as I understand the evidence, is why aren't they always vastly better than the polls, given that supposedly they should take lots of other information? But I mean, they're fine. They're another way of predicting what's going on. As far as the influence of the polls themselves go, that you raised, Polly, it's a good question, a perennial question. I think it's still one that it's kind of really hard to find definitive answers on the impact it might have. It does seeing your candidate being behind in the polls motivate you to get out and vote, or does it kind of depress you and decide that you can't be bothered and there's no point? I think it's not clear what the actual outcome of all of that is, which I think has probably two consequences. The first of which is that, going back to my original point, we as pollsters and others using and commentating on polls need to be clear about understanding uncertainty and what polls are good at and what polls are not so good at, and understanding their limitations. But secondly, people are interested in polls. I think understanding what your fellow citizens think is a useful part of the democratic process. No pollster is, as far as I know, there's no sensible pollster is kind of daft enough to say that we should have government by opinion poll or government by focus group or anything ridiculous like that. So to say that they should not, we want to ban them, why don't we say we should ban newspapers or we should ban other forms of comment on what's going on? And they do have their faults, they definitely have their limitations, but we are trying to be an objective and independent view on public opinion, which ought to be a useful, if not the only tool in understanding what goes on in a democracy.
Thanks, Gideon. Harry?
So I think there's two things I'd like to pick up. One is on the what if no polls, as a kind of question. I think there is a counterexample which is sort of commonly used usually by apologists of polls, admittedly, but which is the Oldham by-election in 2015 or 2016, can't remember now, which didn't have any polls because all the pollsters were not, there's not much constituency polling anyway, because it's very difficult to do and for various reasons. And also, it was just after the 2015 general election, which had been a disaster for several pollsters, for most pollsters. And as such, they were touching it with a barge pole. And the narrative that therefore came out, because there was no information about it at all, was that it was really going to be close between UKIP and Labour. And that was on the basis of people going into, journalists going into Oldham and talking to voters, and what both Labour and the UKIP were saying on from their kind of spin rooms or whatever about what they thought was happening. And what the end result was Labour won by 60.60. So that's kind of example of what would happen in all elections, likely. Not that they would always be completely mad in that direction, but there would be no control over what that story is. So what polls do is give you a range in which that is, and then trying to understand what that there is uncertainty around that. Polls are fallible, not only in individual ones with a margin of error, but overall there is potential for, and clearly there's consistent issue around there being a skew in the people who talk to pollsters versus and them not being completely representative of everyone, including the ones who don't. But if communicating that and giving people a ballpark and saying, oh, if it's within 5 points, even if you're like Biden was and getting on average 8.9 point leads nationally, and sometimes getting well into double digits, you still aren't guaranteed to win it, but you can be fairly sure that they're favourites, and that's the way to try to think about it, rather than saying you don't know. It could be any of them, and it's entirely based on what the spin rooms say and the kind of gut feeling of journalists and the people that they vox pop in city centres is much worse than polling. I think that's the key thing to kind of bear in mind, that there would still be narratives. They wouldn't, as has definitely been shown by that Oldham election, and I think it's probably obvious from the start, journalists would not refrain from trying to predict what was going to happen and saying if it was going to be close. If they didn't have polls to do that, they would just be doing it on gut instinct rather than having any kind of useful information about it. And that, in my opinion, would be much worse. But that being said, I think it's quite clear that they do make a difference. That there's pretty strong evidence that close elections have much high turnout rates, and that if you therefore give the information that it's going to be a close race, that you're more likely to get both sides to turn out. But which I think is a good thing. But the alternative is not that no one has any idea and therefore there's no sway in either direction. It's just that they get swayed by something without any evidence at all, rather than uncertain but useful evidence, which is what polls are. The other thing I was going to mention was about prediction markets again, which is a thing around what the extra information is that prediction markets bring in and how useful that is. And I think it's kind of a question which from my side, from what it looks like to me, as someone who hasn't spent a huge amount of time looking at prediction markets, is that there's a tendency, at least in big high-profile elections, for it to be kind of saying that it's going to go in a similar way to what it's done in previous elections. So if you look at 2016, the prediction markets were much less likely to give Brexit a chance than the polls were. If you were following the polls, especially the ones before, the ones prior to the final set of polls, which in general I would tend to push towards you ignoring on the basis that they're more likely to be herding towards one side or the other. The majority of or at least half of the polls in the couple of weeks running up to Brexit was showing it's at least within the margin of error and frequently with Leave ahead. And you would have got pretty good odds, even actually after it was pretty clear that Brexit was going to happen on the betting markets. I know that Ethan's company didn't exist back then, so he gets no blame for this at all. But you could get it. There was silly money, and I think that was likely to be on the basis of what had happened in 2014 in the Scottish referendum, Scottish independence referendum, in 2015 in the general election, in which it was a kind of conservative status quo swing. And then you can also see evidence for the same actually with Trump, which was in the primaries, where again you could get good odds, even when the polls were showing of Republicans that Trump was surely going to win, that actually they were still thinking that the status quo was likely to win out, and then he became the Republican nominee. And now when you see it in 2020, what people were predicting was that the same thing has happened last time would happen again, that Trump and the chaotic option is, I'm trying to think of the right words, tends to be to overperform, and that will, in this case, that was the case compared with what the polls were showing. But I would question whether that's necessarily wisdom and added usefulness and predictive utility, as opposed to just a sway in a particular direction, which is the way that it happened last time.
So none of us here are journalists, though I confess to having been a journalist at the beginning of my career for 2 full years. So you can hate on me if you like. But I'm really fascinated by this question of we just need to be more transparent about the uncertainty. And, actually pollsters or prediction markets, you guys go on the media and you talk about stuff, and you talk about the margin of error and you say that you're uncertain. And yet, nevertheless, the spin and the headlines and the noise is all generated by simplistic interpretations that, you know, that remove that complexity, because, you know, complexity is boring. And you know what they say about a lie getting around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And the same thing is true for simplicity over complexity. So with the caveat that we can't really fix the media industry from here, do you think that, is it possible to actually change the way these things are interpreted by people outside of the polling industry, the prediction market industry, of people who are data literate, statistically literate? I don't know, is it within our gift even? Gideon?
So it's a big question. I'll try to answer it quickly. I mean, I still think there's things we can do better as pollsters to express this. We do try, but we can probably still do better. Again, as far as it comes to kind of media and journalists, probably much like polls, there are good examples and there are not so good examples. So, you know, we've seen growth in data journalism, for example, you know, and lots of that is great. You know, kind of great visualizations, great understanding, and as you talked about, that ability to explain quite kind of complex issues, but in sort of simple terms and easy to understand terms is a real step forward. At the same time, without coming across as old as I am, you know, you can also see just that focus on the horse race. You know, sort of, I think the way that it's getting worse in the other direction is, you know, one poll with one headline horse race figure gets tweeted on social media and gets pushed out. Loads, as you say, kind of halfway around the world, regardless of whether it's an outlier or not. And that is difficult. You know, I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is. You know, despite it might have had, you know, there might have been caveats attached to it, or there might have been sort of other data that is more interesting rather than just the horse race. I don't have an immediate answer to that. So, you know, but you know, we can keep on trying to do better.
Ethan, how about, you know, when you're out there in the world talking about your different sorts of information and insight or predictions, do you find that they're interpreted with the nuance or that they're simplified? Yeah, definitely. I think what's important to note is that there's so many narratives coming across from a drastic number of news sources, especially in the United States. There's a lot of partisan bias attached to the various news outlets that people listen to and read every day. You're going to turn on one channel, you're going to see completely different information than what's on another channel. And I think what's interesting and cool about prediction markets is that they cut through the BS to some extent. You're not going to have drastic differences between Fox News and MSNBC. It's gonna reach an equilibrium somewhere that's pretty close to right. And I think that kind of unbiased equilibrium information can sort of build a new class of journalism, data-based journalism. You can do data-based journalism off of polls, you can do it off of prediction markets, off of information markets, pretty much anything. And you don't necessarily have to look at one market. You can look at a variety of markets that are fairly similar. You can look at certain state markets, and you can look at the presidential election market and kind of build a picture about what could happen. It's not strictly based off of one single market. You can. What's cool about decentralized information markets is that you can have a market on pretty much anything, super specific local markets to macro markets. And using those markets, journalists can build a picture about what's going to happen pretty much anywhere in the world about any event. And that's wholly unique of information markets. Harry, you used to work for Sky News, a big media organization. Did you find that findings were reported more accurately with more caveats because you were right there in the organization?
Certainly, I think we won some battles to make sure that the nuances were better reported or better reflected in the reporting. But I do think that across all media platforms, it is difficult to get that nuance across. The question, I think, is how we can do that better, and there are some questions that I know the British Polling Council have been working on this to try to make sure that they get those nuances reflected and hammer home the importance of doing that. the downside of that is that more complexity doesn't necessarily mean that people are more likely to understand it. Actually, in fact, I did a poll about this with Sky Data with Cardiff University, looking at what happens when you give people more information and different visualizations about what margins of error mean. And actually, people just got more confused. And the people who had the right answer from the start got less sure that they were right in terms of the way they were interpreting it if you gave them more information. So there isn't an easy answer to it. Trying to get people to understand statistics is not going to be a way to get people to take that uncertainty seriously. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but it's an issue that they face. And the question then is it better to have those polls there than not having them? And the answer, I think, for the reasons that I've already outlined, is definitely yes. Although Ethan is definitely right. There's a role for prediction markets, and it's an interesting role, and it takes into account stuff that polling doesn't. Although polling forecasts often do, and don't have some of the downsides that prediction markets do, but aren't available for the vast majority of elections. And prediction markets have a place in that regard. But I think that polling is definitely not dead.
So final question for you all is, prediction markets are this innovation when it comes to trying to work out what's going to happen in elections, right? But whether it's on the prediction market side or within polling, everything is changing. Like, what kind of innovations are we likely to see in these industries or markets over the course of the next 5 to 10 years? What's to look out for? Ethan, what do you reckon about prediction markets and their evolution?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even in the past 5-7 years, it's pretty clear that decentralized information markets and prediction markets are really the future. Centralized ones are riddled with barriers to entry, fees, and whatnot. And when you cut out those things, you get a much more accurate picture of what's going to happen. So with the rise of Ethereum, which is where Polymarket is built on, you're able to have people from all over the world contributing, and that's really important. And essentially, as we move into the future, we're going to see more people participating. We're going to see more popping up likely, and just the more people that participate, the better the information is what we're seeing simply from the election market and other markets that we've run in the past. By allowing people to join, we're just improving the accuracy and improving what goes on with polls and prediction markets as a whole. That's where we stand.
Harry, what are we going to innovate at Demos?
We're certainly going to innovate. I don't think we'll innovate on voting intention polling. I don't think we're going to go anywhere like that soon. But a thing which for all polls, including the stuff that we do and including voting intention, is finding ways to make sure that your sample is representative. And an issue for the US is and for all pollsters everywhere, is making sure that those samples are the samples of people you are talking to represent the people that they aren't. And this is an example of that being off to a point which is not problematic for the vast majority of the sorts of polling that we do, and the vast majority of polling that is done across the world, but is still an issue which you should everyone will be keeping an eye on, and might become more and more difficult. We're seeing fewer and fewer people answering the phone, fewer and fewer people responding to any kind of approach from pollsters. So finding new ways to bring people in and combating those issues. Potentially I suspect this is the thing that the US will be looking at, is finding ways to use attitudinal weights, for example, to look at, okay, so we're not able to, at the moment, even if we're getting the right demographics, we're missing something about people who sway towards Trump. Are there, if we can get some gold standard polls which have to limit the sampling bias as far as possible of non-respondents, and then weight towards those to make sure that you're getting the attitudes in the right way, might be a thing. And then there's also a big data thing, and trying to get something which looks at using large unrepresentative samples as an alternative if you're really struggling to get representative ones. They still have similar problems as normal polls do in sampling, though, and the success of MRP was held up of that with YouGov in 2017. They weren't as successful in 2019. They were very unsuccessful in 2020 in the US. So there are definite challenges to that as well. It's not at all clear that traditional polling via online or via telephone is not going to be the way forward, at least in the short and medium term.
How about you, Gideon, for the final word? Ipsos Mori is a giant of polling and public opinion research more broadly. What's innovation look like for your company?
Well, thanks very much. I'm not going to repeat what Harry said about polling. I think actually probably what's interesting is all the other work that we do. If we're thinking, trying to expand our horizons, is newer ways of involving the public. There's sort of a whole movement towards more kind of deliberative approaches to involving the public to talk about what's going on in their worlds. Obviously, lots of use of digital in terms of, particularly nowadays with COVID, although traditional methods will come back, but there's lots of innovative traditional ways of talking to the public, collecting real-time data, ethnography, and so on, and of course building in other data streams, like just being able to look at what the general trends are, what does market data tell us, and so on, which I think is kind of lots of interesting and innovative approaches that will help us, if we move away just from the horse race, getting a better understanding of what our society looks like and involving public opinion more in the decisions that affect us.
Enormously interesting. We've come to the end of our time, but thank you all three of you for sharing your views. I think we have come to the conclusion that polling isn't dead, it's super useful, but prediction markets are also super useful. And actually when the two interact, they can provide new insights, but actually predicting the future is always going to be an inexact science, and people aren't very good at understanding probability. But maybe that's something we can all unite behind, is more statistical education. I have a statistics A-level, so I feel like, pretty top drawer, but then I also did drama, so I'm a bit of an unusual character. Thank you so much, and thank you for those who have listened and contributed, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Polly. That was great, and thank you to all the panelists. This time, for those who were with us a few minutes ago, I'm not on mute, so that's good. That's a step forward. That was a great little panel, and I think it further underlined, I think, many of the conclusions from today. Our democracy is a work in progress, and in fact, in its most real sense, it is a set of technologies, and so that it is absolutely no surprise that there are both issues and opportunities that lie within the new technologies as they emerge and they get adopted. Democracy is, perhaps you could argue, a birthright, or some people would argue that, but also an earned right in the Ayn Rand sense, and therefore a responsibility that we tend to this over time. It's a kind of an array of rolling experiments, and sometimes, as I mentioned before, kind of forks to entirely different approaches. On the topic from this panel right now, we would think definitely in Fabric that the decentralized prediction markets do have the potential to be agile enough to spring up around many exciting, or kind of the critical issues of the day, however granular or localized, and be able to access a broader and more current set of data, arguably. And if we can get to a point, and people are working on this, and we can have a kind of deterministically verifiable consensus around truth in these networks, including perhaps things like attitudinal weightings that Harry from Demos was just espousing, I think this could be a real step forward. But as summed up, I think polling prediction markets probably still both alive and well. But unfortunately, one of a couple of data sources amongst very many data sources that swirl around your average individual within today's society in an increasingly confusing and sometimes misdirecting fashion. So I think my biggest takeaway from all of the conversation today is that education on what is your right, your privilege, perhaps your responsibility as a part owner of the democracy you live within, as for each individual, and how that should be expressed, and that further education on not just familiarity or even literacy, but in fact, high levels of competence in social media, how to deal with fact-checking, memes, the whole principle of debating online, and then even as Polly says, maybe some improved education and statistics is pretty pivotal. Probably incorporating yet more technology to be able to do this effectively, and probably, I guess, do this effectively with much more homeschooling if we're not careful. Perhaps the topic of another cog extra. So with that, I'd just like to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope that you have maybe learned something new, maybe had some interesting thoughts prompted, hopefully maybe even met somebody new on some of the online forums. So do go and try and do that on the CogX platform. Please get back to us with any feedback on anything from the panelists to the topics to the format to the platform itself. And if you do feel so minded, please feel free to follow Fabric Ventures on Fabric_VC on Twitter, and myself, Richard Muirhead, also on Twitter. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye for now.